where will you find resilience? REdeploy.
Hi, so thank you very much for the warm welcome here. I want to talk today about cognitive linguistics at the sharp end, prototypes, metaphors, and resilience. So I'll start with just a little bit, if I can figure out where the button is for advancing the slides on this one. There we go. I'll talk just a little bit briefly about some of my background to give you some idea of what the context is and where this is coming from. I started out working at American Express, which is a fairly large company in technology. I moved from there to PCS Health Systems, which was at the time the largest prescription claims adjudicator in the United States. While I was there, I was a senior developer. I carried a pager for 4 of the 5 years that I was there, 24/7, 365 days a year, as a person to escalate to. I got frustrated with technology. There were a lot of things that I was seeing that I couldn't express my frustrations with because I didn't have vocabulary. I went back to school full-time to complete my bachelor's work, and along the way I discovered linguistics. Now, linguistics gave me a way to actually have vocabulary and a mental concept of how to talk about some of the issues. This led ultimately to me getting a master's degree in English Linguistics. So I'll be basing, in a sense, this talk has been 18 years in development, which is a little longer than most talks, probably. And then after a series of events, I landed at Ubisoft. I've been at Ubisoft for the last 8 years. For the last 5 years, I've been involved actively in helping remediate most of the major incidents that we've experienced with games for our online systems. And the interesting thing is that I've actively used everything that I'm going to talk about in helping us navigate through those incidents. So, the plan for the talk today is I'm going to start by talking a little bit about what cognitive linguistics is and about what the sharp end is. This is going to set the context for the rest of the discussion. From there, we'll move into talking about natural categories. These are not sets. These are how do we actually do cognition? Because one of the fundamental points here is that the way that the mind does categories both enables and constrains our ability to reason about things. From there, we'll move into taxonomies, which gets into relationships between the different categories, and how do we do abstraction, how do we do specialization as cognitive things. Then we move into cognitive metaphors. This is a major pillar of cognitive linguistics. It talks about how do we actually structure the abstract spaces. So we'll go through some of that. Along the way, I'll give examples of it in terms of how these things play out a little bit in the way that we think about in-the-moment activities. And then I'll try and bring it back around to resilience here at the tail end to sort of bundle everything up and give some of the key takeaways from all of this for us. So let's start with talking about cognitive linguistics and the sharp end. So to start with, what is cognitive linguistics in the first place? Way back in the 1960s, Noam Chomsky proposed that we should follow a formal model of logic as an underlying model of how to treat natural language. This led to generative systems. This led to Montague proposing essentially model theory as a model of meaning and truth. And along come other people, and George Lakoff points out here that his concern is to ask what we need to hypothesize about the nature of cognition in general in order to account for the phenomena of natural language. Chomsky had evolved into a position of there's something special about the brain, there's some challenges that come up with that position. So one of the things that we have is if we're doing with classical categories, classical model theory, all of these types of things, you have a basic division. Things are either predictable or they're grouped arbitrarily. This gets into your set theory where you can say, so we've either got a rule, we've got an intention behind it that we can articulate, we have intersections, we have unions in order to build things up, which is kind of arbitrary in a sense, or we have simply lists of things, exceptions. What Lakoff proposed as an alternative based on a whole lot of evidence was that there's another option that is neither of these. And that option is that things are motivated. What this means is that we can't predict them, but they're also not arbitrary. They're constrained in various ways. And we want to explore how cognition actually works, how we think about things. So that's the background a little bit for where cognitive linguistics is coming from, is to investigate how does the brain actually do this? How does the mind actually do this? And what evidence do we have? So the other piece to the talk is that we're going to focus on the sharp end. Now, many of you have probably heard the blunt and sharp end distinction. For those of you who haven't, potentially, the blunt end is the place where you have space to actually think and reflect. We saw this a little bit earlier with James' presentation and with Ray's presentation about taking time, about the more analytical approaches. This contrasts with needing to do things in the moment. In the moment, we are tightly time constrained, there are real-time constraints, there are cognitive constraints, we only have a limited set of information, and everything that we do is going to be conditioned by the policies, by our experience, by what has come before as we evolve through it. So, taking that as the foundation, what we want to start to look at is what are the ways in which this works, so that we can understand a little bit better how we reason and how this plays out in practice. So we'll start with natural categories. And for this, we need to go back to the 1970s and work with Eleanor Rosch. Rosch was essentially a cognitive psychologist looking into various things, and she started with looking at colors. Now, there was interesting work done in linguistics related to colors going back to 1969. Berlin and Kay proposed that looking at all languages globally, worldwide, that they had access to, that there's an actual series, an order in which languages acquire color terms. And it starts with black and white. So if you've only got 2 color terms, these will be them. If you get a 3rd color term, it will be red. You get others, you get yellow or green, and then you'll get the other one before you actually get any others. Then you get blue, then you get brown, and then you get these last 4 color terms. Now this is really weird if you think about it, right? If we think about arbitrary collections of colors, arbitrary sets that are just, well, it could be in this wavelength or it could be in that wavelength, why would languages actually behave this way? Why would worldwide, with the thousands of languages that we have information about, why would this be true? So Rosch did the following type of experiment. She took color sets like this, and she went to a community that had only 2 color words. So they had this light and that dark. They had this warm and cool distinction. And she asked the question, can we teach them colors? Can we teach them these other categories? So you take something like this, and it turns out this particular one is not going to be easy to learn. This is going to be harder to learn than others. And the way that this plays out is that there's actually focal colors. Those named color categories, our bodies have perceptual apparatus that drive those factors. Those are the ones that are easy to access. So if we look at this color scheme, in the top row, what you've got is somewhere intermediate between yellow and green. So if you try and group all of those, it's going to be harder than if you group on focal colors. In the bottom, we're halfway between green and blue. If you try and group those, it's going to be harder. You're going to not retain it as well, you're going to spend more energy. The time to actually do tests with these are going to make a major difference. So when you group them this way, there's faster access, there's faster uptake, there's faster time to better retention and better usability. So let's talk about birds now. Okay, birds, they've got wings, they've got feathers, they fly, they eat seeds, well, maybe they eat meat, right? Maybe they swim a little bit, some swimming. Well, maybe they don't really necessarily fly, maybe they don't have wings, maybe they don't even really have feathers, but they're all birds still. But some of them are better examples of birds than others. And then there's things that aren't birds at all. It's also not a human, by the way. Humans are not zebras either. So we get these effects, and what we see in natural categories is that there are asymmetries. Asymmetries are fundamental to cognition. So prospect theory is one place that we see this. This came out of Kahneman and Tversky's work, and they actually demonstrated effects with endowment effects where if you have a cup in hand, you will value it more than somebody who's willing to buy it from you because you already have it. This is a form of asymmetry. There's another effect that comes up. If you think about being in Paris and you're going from your house to the Eiffel Tower, and you think about that, and you make a judgment about it, and then you go the other way to go from the Eiffel Tower to your house, people will actually judge these as being different distances. The Eiffel Tower is closer to your house than your house is to the Eiffel Tower. Now, how many people think that this is reality out in the world, that if you measure it, that it's going to be different in the two directions? Anybody? No? And yet everybody does this. This is an asymmetry. We see these as cognitive reference points. So we get another effect here. Integers. Integers are generated. They're just systematic. So when we say 997, it's about 1,000. Okay, great. 1,000 of that, 997. Huh? Weird. So there are certain elements of natural categories that actually play a special role. And these help us simplify things into these idealized cognitive models. So we start to talk now about the categories, and there are typical cases. So these are things that are the way we expect them to be, that are most commonly together. There are ideal cases. These are, everything comes together perfectly. The bird eats seeds, it flies, it has feathers. All of the things you would expect. It's bird-sized, it's not bird-sized. Then there are nightmare cases. Nightmare cases are things you want to avoid. This is the emus, right? This is somebody treating a zebra as a bird. And then we get into, there are salient exemplars. Salient exemplar, a very common one right now, has to deal with aircraft. The Boeing Max 737 looms large in how we reason about things. We will make judgment calls about aircraft and about aircraft safety based on those stories because they are relevant in our mental landscape. They carry more mental weight. So now we want to dig a little bit further into what are these categories? Why do we have this? And this is where we get into gestalts. So to start with, there are sets. Sets are either you're in, you're out, straight up membership function. We know that categories like birds don't work this way. So one of the ways that people have modeled this is with fuzzy sets, where the membership function is a distribution between 0 and 1, which is all well and good, except when the intersection properties don't actually match. So a working mother is not the best example of somebody who's working and the best example of mother that can possibly exist. So the way that this actually, the things that Roche found is that natural categories have a correlational structure that allows us to learn them, to develop them, to understand them. And this is a cluster, they are clusters of co-occurring attributes. They are also converging with this sequences of motor movements, so action schemas, if you will. They also have physical similarity of shape, so that we can perceptually detect them. And they have identifiability of average shapes. What this means is that if you take all birds and you average the shapes of a number of images of birds, you get something that is still recognizably a bird. If you try and do this with all animals, you get a blob. You don't get something that looks like a bird, or a fish, or a horse, you just get a blob. You can do the same thing with furniture, you get another blob. It doesn't work. So there are these correlational things, and it turns out that they all drive to the same thing. So it's overdetermined for the categories. This is part of the reason that we get this variation, these prototype effects. So it is a gestalt, a number of properties that come together to project into a single perceived whole. They're not fuzzy sets, they're not sets, they're these weird other things that our brain is doing for us. So, what do we have? Well, we have image schemas. These are things that are how we perceive them, how we visualize them. We have action schemas. Action schemas are how we interact with things. It's you can sit in a chair. It's you can set things on a table. It is whatever you do with horses, like riding on them if you've done that. And then Lakoff suggests that there are two other things that we'll talk about. One of which is metonymic mappings, and one of which is metaphoric mappings. And in Lakoff's work from the 1980s, those four things are what he sees as foundational for helping us to understand how we categorize things. So, you get cats. In North America, have any of you ever petted a cat? Yeah? Yeah? Okay. So you know how they actually turn their head for an ear scratch? You have an action schema. The part of your brain that correlates with activity is active when you actually think about a cat. Here in North America, the same is not true for elephants. So the really interesting thing here is Damasio and his colleagues have demonstrated that people that have brain damage in the motor area of their brain will forget about cats but will not forget about elephants. People that have damage to the image processing areas of the brain will forget about elephants and not cats. So we actually have direct evidence that the brain is doing something with meaning where it changes. This has a major effect on automation if you stop and think about this. When we automate something, we no longer have the action schemas, the execution plans of motor memory of interacting with the load balancer because we automated over the top of it. This is going to interplay with what the experience is of trying to diagnose and solve a problem in real time when, whoops, traffic isn't routing correctly anymore. So, Margaret Tversky, her husband was Amos Tversky of not prototype theory, prospect theory. Okay, so she commented that novices and the half of us low in spatial ability understand structure, but it takes expertise or ability or effort to understand dynamics. So this is the execution plan. It takes more. You have to have more experience in order to actually get that level of knowledge and understanding. So when we know something, we don't necessarily know it in the same way, depending on the context. So we're going to switch over to taxonomies for a couple minutes here. And taxonomies, we want to talk first off about levels. So what's a taxonomy? It's basically your abstractions, right? So it's things that group together and things that subdivide. So we have things that we experience in the world. We have perceptions. We have cats. We have things we interact with. We have these correlational structures. And these are basic level categories. These are the things that you acquire first. They actually show up in languages first as well. So American Sign Language developed basic level category vocabulary before they developed anything more refined. So they would talk about dogs before they would talk about hounds. They talked about dogs before they talked about mammals. And we still see gaps in the linguistic evidence in developing languages surrounding this. There are also superordinate levels. So superordinate categories are different. They're abstractions. They tend to be driven around functional properties, things that we interact with, ways that we interact with them, rather than things that we can perceive. They actually don't have execution schemas associated with them. They don't have image schemas associated with them. Remember that average shape thing about the average shape of all animals? Yeah, you can't do that. So we have to have some other way that we actually understand superordinate categories that differs from basic level. Subordinate level is when you get more refined. This is when you go from birds to sparrows and hawks, for example. So let's talk about chairs. Chairs are a thing. We can sit in them. We have action schemas for sitting in them. We have different types. So we may have a desk chair. Right? We may have an armchair. We may have a rocking chair. Now, there's also a part-whole relationship in here. So there's a seat of the chair, there's a back of the chair. So we get these idealized cognitive schemas of what a chair is. And the category of seat does not have an independent existence from the more global schema of the chair. It only exists in the context of the chair. So your parts and your wholes interact with one another in the way that we actually even identify them. They're not just out in the world. They are part of our, how do we interact? How do we live in the world? What's our experience of it? So I mentioned metonymy a little bit ago. Metonymy is a technical word in linguistics for things that are part-whole relationships and using those in relationships. So let's take a category, mother. With the category of mother, there are a number of things that can be in play. It can be the person that actually gave birth. It can be the person that's nurturing someone. It can be somebody who donated their egg. There are a number of different senses of being a mother. So there are some examples of mother, if we look around the world, that meet all of these. They are the nurturance, they are the birth mother, they are the one that is in the home. In 1980s style, when this was actually written and talked about initially, there was the homemaker that was a very typical element of this. And so what we end up with is that category, that central category, was the prototypical example of this. It is central, the same way that the bird with the feathers are central. But there are others. So a working mother, for example, isn't just someone who works who happens to be a mother. It is, but only in a special sense, because if somebody gave birth to a child and put them up for adoption and they happen to work, they're not classified as a working mother. So our categories are not as simple as you might think if you just are taking a formal approach to this. Model theoretic, what we typically do with, well, computer programs and mathematics that we've all trained in. So this is where we get some of these interesting sort of effects. And then for prototypicality, what we get is that one unmarked category that satisfies all of these attributes is actually what we use to identify the category, and the others are more peripheral. So we get prototypicality effects, asymmetries that come up based on these generalization specialization structures as well. So expertise comes into play in this as well. Now, we've talked about this enough to understand a little bit about it. So let's say this is a basic level category for somebody. Maybe this is your application developer. So they've got this. Because they're an application developer, they also have expertise. And that expertise, one of the things that was remarked very early on, actually generates more basic level categories that are more refined. The first observation of this was with airline mechanics, where their image schemas and the amount of recall and how they classified airplanes actually differed and had finer grained categories that they reasoned with than non-mechanics did. So now we put this in combination with another person who's got similar upbringing, they have similar basic categories, so that you have common ground for communicating. But they've got a different expertise. Maybe they're a network engineer. So your network engineer comes along with their refined knowledge of what exactly is a router and what exactly is a load balancer and what exactly is a firewall. And your application developer that has a mental model of, well, messages flow from one machine to another and they just sort of get there and they don't have that refined knowledge. When you're in an incident, at the moment of trying to diagnose a problem, you get crosstalk between these where you have to actually navigate between the two and make sure that you're respecting the reasoning. Because we reason with these categories. They are fundamental to it. So your application developer doesn't have refined categories to understand that it's the load balancer versus the firewall that's in play. Whereas your network engineer doesn't know about your 17 different microservices and the internals of their algorithms. So we have to actually respect that and work through that in communication. Especially if you start talking about it, like your network engineer might say, oh yeah, we've got this routing going on right here, and here's these attributes of whatever it may be. I'm not a network engineer, obviously. So we get that coming into play. So let's do one other thing with taxonomies. Let's talk about zebras again. Remember, they're not birds. They're not humans. But there are different types. There are 3 different species of zebras. So there's Rebbe zebra, and there's a plains zebra, and there's a mountain zebra. Now, with taxonomies, we tend to want to think of it as a strict hierarchy. Problem with this is that in biology, there's 2 different ways of doing taxonomies, one of which is based on form, one of which is based on genealogical branches. If the zebras are treated as genealogical branches, they actually aren't all zebras. They are not that closely linked. One of them, the mountain zebra, is actually closer to horses than it is to the other zebras. But from a form standpoint, they're all the same. So experts do not agree. Unlike your basic level categories, the abstractions do not converge. This is a fundamental property of abstract categories, is that you get these non-convergence effects. If you assume that it's converging, that your folk theories of how taxonomies are supposed to work are going to tell you it will, it's not going to work. So we'll move now to one more step, which is cognitive metaphors. I want to take this be an example. Okay, so we're going to talk about arguments. We have some nice examples of arguments with moral cognition, with philosophy of the ways that these things interplay in relatively abstract spaces. There's logical arguments in all of the presentations that we've given here at this conference. So we start with the notion of a logical argument. And how do we understand it? Well, from a linguistic standpoint, we get things like, she constructed a solid argument. We have a good foundation for the argument. Here, we're using a more concrete category of building in order to help us understand this abstract structure of argument. We get another one. Your argument has a lot of content. Well, it's not a building-like thing. What was the core of his argument? Buildings don't really have cores. This is a container as a related category that we have more concrete physical experience with. So as we move through here now, we've got 2 other categories that we sort of put together with it somehow. And then we get journeys. So we will proceed in a step-by-step fashion. A building doesn't proceed, a container doesn't proceed. This is evolutionary time. This is a little bit more dynamic in nature. We've covered a lot of ground. And then we get other things like war. He won the argument. I couldn't defend that point. So we see that logical arguments don't really have their own experience that we have of them, that we use to talk about them, but we understand them in terms of other categories that we do have experience with. So we're constructing up from the basic level categories, we're constructing up through the levels of abstraction. But this isn't a straight taxonomy for these. So we have all of these, and what we want to understand a little bit more is structuring of them. How do they relate to one another? What's happening here? What's happening is that we have a notion of in our mind of logical argument. This is an abstract category. Oh, by the way, all those software systems that we're working on, they're all abstract categories. We're understanding what's below the line in terms of what we can perceive above the line and the metaphorical ways that we talk about what we see above the line. And all of these things help structure different aspects of the abstract categories. So, the thing that happens, if you get stuck on talking in terms of one of these, or it highlights certain elements of it and hides others. So if you're talking about an argument for something, let's say you're in the middle of resolving your incident, and people start talking about how we need to, combat the DDoS that's coming in. This highlights elements of combativeness, of competition. It does not help you with your journey through it. So you actually hide pieces. I've seen this in practice in incidents that I've helped resolve, where people took one metaphor and they were looking at the problem, and the actual thing we needed to address in order to actually get back to a normal operating state was actually hidden by the vocabulary that they were using. It wasn't until we actually took a look from another perspective using a different metaphor, switching from what are the interacting services to what is the path of the request through the system, that we were able to identify where are things not behaving the way that we expect them to. So really important. Another thing that happens is that all of these are partial. So arguments aren't journeys. They have aspects of them. We use journey to help us understand the notion of an argument. But it's partial structure. So not everything about a journey is there. You're not going to have the pebbles underfoot that are actually causing your feet pain. You're not going to talk about an argument in terms of, yeah, I like had to stop and bandage my foot because I got blisters. It just doesn't transfer. So it's a partial transfer of all of this information. But we can and do transfer some other elements. So these are productive. So there's conventionalized versions of transfer, and we can extend this. So we might take things about journey where we're proceeding through things and go, yeah, so we've got these hypotheses and we're working through it, but it's really shady over here. I don't really understand it. Well, we're transferring things that we know about physical journeys walking through a forest to this domain of arguments, but it is not fully conventionalized. So these are productive. We can actually bring more pieces of information over. The other thing that transfers is logical structure things. So I think I mentioned before that we reason in terms of typicality. Here what happens is we may have the building saying, here are pieces and parts of this. Well, we know things about buildings. We draw conclusions about buildings. We will transfer those over to the other portion. Looking back at birds, if we start talking about penguins, okay? Anybody here think that penguins fly? Okay, I don't see any hands suggesting that penguins fly. If we start talking about penguins as the thing that we're perceiving, and we start talking about them in terms of birds, well, what happens? The person that steps into the conversation is going to conclude that that thing we're talking about flies. Because that's the typical case. I've seen this happen a lot with classes of error. So we see a set of symptoms, and we immediately jump to, I've seen these symptoms before, the cause is that, right? The other correlated things are that, so we need to go mitigate that. Well, except those symptoms can arise for other reasons. This is your atypical case, this is your nightmare case, this is the, you can't make those jumps safely. So this is how we actually structure and reason about abstract things. So let's bring this back around a little bit more to resilience, right? And the question that I want to ask here is, where does resilience even come from? Well, we've got a lot of answers to it. But I think each of those answers is a way of structuring it from a particular domain. We've seen this coming up from the automation side with Maurice's talk. We saw this coming in from the philosophy side with Jade's talk. We saw this coming in from the medical side with Dr. Richard Cook's discussion of bones yesterday. I think there's another aspect to it. Remember those asymmetries? Well, this is where we get rid of some of the fragility in our systems. Part of the thing that happens around all of this is that if you can't get to the asymmetries, if you can't say these things differ depending on the perspective that we look at it from, then you introduce exactly the classes of fragility that we see with automation because you're trying to do this as a mechanistic interpretation of what these things are. So we've seen a number of aspects here. So we've seen a little bit about gestalts and the way that things have to come together into a whole. We've seen a little bit about levels and how we navigate the levels, and it's not predictable, right? We go back to the beginning of my discussion where I was talking about it's not fully predictable, it is not fully arbitrary, it is something in between, where we're navigating among sets of constraints where we're both simultaneously over-constrained and under-constrained, and things are motivated. They make sense, but only in hindsight, only in the way that they connect together. We've seen part-whole structures and the way that they play into this. We've seen a little bit about structuring. We've explored it through some specific examples of colors, birds, bears, zebras. These things in the experimental evidence, we actually see measurable differences in how long it takes to recognize groupings, depending on whether they actually cohere with these perceptual models or not. So, bringing this back around to sort of what are some of the takeaways here. Hopefully, this has given you some idea of what basic categories are, the way that they interplay with this, and an understanding, a little bit of an insight into the fact that your basic categories actually condition your reasoning. They enable it, and they constrain it. You can't get away from them. They are the foundation of how we reason. Things that condition our reasoning are typical cases. We jump to conclusions based on the typical case. Salient cases that stand out, these are our cognitive reference points. Little tidbit, the ideal case, we tend to go there when we're planning. So when we move to that future perspective view of things, when we're looking forward, we tend to use the ideal case for that. When we look backwards, and we're trying to do analysis or blame for what happened, we tend to use the nightmare case. So there's differences, there's asymmetries in the way that we use the cases that come out of these bits of research. And metaphorical structure both highlights and hides aspects of abstract concepts. So when we think about our scenarios, when we think about all of our runbooks, when we think about our automation, every one of these is going to prevent us from seeing things by making other things more evident. Where things hide, where we get into trouble, is with those things that are hidden, and we need to find ways to shift our perspective and move through that. With all of this, the way that the human brain works both enables and conditions our ability to reason about our systems, about the world around us, to make sense of things. So, my real hope for this, besides all of this, is that all of you come away with this with just a little bit of an understanding of what cognitive linguistics has to potentially contribute to a discussion of resilience engineering, and that there's a valuable space to explore through this. And with that, thank you very much for your time and attention. It's been great getting a chance to come up and talk with you about this. And there are a number of references here at the tail end. And I will try and get something posted for people that are interested with all of these references in them.